Hello everyone. Thank you for tuning in. So in the last lecture, we have seen what is a Lambda function as a service, what does it offer, and what features does a Lambda function have. So in this tutorial, we'll have an hands-on exercise wherein we will be creating a Lambda function from the console and try to see the different concepts that we have discussed in action. Right, let's get started. So for the people who are not aware of what a Lambda function is, let me just give a brief overview. So Lambda function is a serverless compute service by AWS Cloud. So using this serverless service, one can mainly focus on the code and not worry about the server or the infrastructure management or creation as such. And basically, Lambda function makes the job of a developer very easy. People can even save a lot of money when there are scenarios where you don't really have to worry, you don't really have to run the instances or warm up the instances or EC2 instances as such for a longer duration of time, wherein you just have to handle the request. So for such scenarios, or for, there can be other scenarios as well, Lambda functions are the way. So we'll dive right into the hands-on. Once you log into your console, search for Lambda from the search box. Click on create function. This was something that was there before, so let me probably delete this. So click on create function. So there are more than a couple of ways of creating a Lambda function. We'll initially start with a blueprint. It's more or less you'll just have a boilerplate code which you can run and test and see if the Lambda function is running or not. So as discussed in the previous video, we have this runtime configuration wherein you can select different runtime execution environments. So let me go ahead and select Python with version 3.7 and give my function name as Python hello world function. And by default, Lambda creates a basic permissions to execute this Lambda function and to create logs of the Lambda execution. So this is the boilerplate code that we'll be getting as a part of this blueprint. And then that's all. The default configuration is this. So we just have to go ahead and click on create function. Once we click on create function, it takes a couple of seconds to actually create the function, and then once it's done, we'll see our function. So this is how the function looks on the console, and this is the piece of code that you will have to worry about. The other infrastructure things are taken care of. And by default, since you have selected Python, the default packages that comes with the Python environment will be available in this execution environment. And let me go ahead and click on test. So this is a functionality using which you can test your Lambda function from the console itself, where you can create a test event and then use that test event to validate your functionality or your function's core functionality. Click on invoke. You see value 1, test event, unsafe. So this is the actual log that you see. Value equal to value 1. So this is what you're printing over there. And this is the test event that you have. If you go to unsafe test event, configure new test. So all the key values are value 1, value 2, and value 3. That's what printed over here. value 1, value 2, and value 3. So this is a basic Lambda structure. You can even make changes from here, or you can upload a zip file of the deployment file, or you can even upload a zip file if you think you are along with the dependencies. If the size of Lambda function is more than 10 MB, then you can upload your Lambda deployment package in S3 and then reference it over here. So in this tutorial, we'll not be going to that. I'll be covering these ways of deployment in another tutorial. Now let us actually go through the different configurations that we have over here. So this is the monitor tab where you actually see the CloudWatch logs. So by default, every Lambda function gets attached to a CloudWatch log policy. When you click on this view CloudWatch logs, you will be taken to the CloudWatch log groups, and you see a log group created against our Lambda function, and this is the stream. So each time this Lambda gets invoked, the log is created with the timestamp. Now let us come back. There are other services as well which you can use. There's a service called X-Ray as well, Lambda Insights, using which you can get fine-grained information of the Lambda services execution, the triggering and the response time, and the concurrency or the time duration of the Lambda execution. Right, now let us go to the configuration. So in the general configuration, we have two major things. One is the memory, the other one is the timeout. So by default, each Lambda function is set to 3 seconds timeout. So that means your Lambda function will be executed for 3 seconds, irrespective of whether the execution is finished or not. So if your code is not getting executed or finished its execution within 3 seconds of time, the Lambda environment gets terminated. So although this can be increased further, this can be increased up until 15 minutes, which is equivalent to 900 seconds. And the memory is the amount of computation that you need, the CPU computation. So if you think if the task that you're trying to execute requires more computation, then it is recommended that you increase this memory so that the execution becomes faster, and the duration of execution will be reduced. So this can also be increased up to 10,240 MB, which is equivalent to 10 GB of memory. And let us come back again, go to configuration, and let us see a few more things. Let's go to the concurrency section. So concurrency is basically the ability to execute the same function asynchronously or concurrently in two different isolated environments. So by default, each account gets an unreserved concurrency of 1000, and it gets associated like this. So if you see the Lambda quota against concurrent executions, initially it is set to 50, but you can increase it up until 1000 for the account, and this is for the whole account. So what happens? Lambda has got that ability where, let's say there is a function which can be called by multiple services. So each of the service can trigger this Lambda function and then can get executed parallelly. And let me show you another one. So there's another concept called provision concurrency. So it's a drawback of a Lambda function. That is, whenever a Lambda function is invoked or triggered by any service, the amount of time it takes from the trigger time and the actual handling time is known as the cold start. And the reason for that delay or the duration is that it takes that amount of time to set up the execution environment as per the dependencies configured. So sometimes the delay may be in milliseconds, and if the dependencies are really big, then it may even go up to few seconds. So to avoid that, what generally people do is, or one way of doing it is having a provision concurrency. So if I click on this provision concurrency, I can select a version. Okay, before doing that, I will have to create an alias or the version of this Lambda. But the matter is that when the provision concurrency is basically having these Lambdas warmed up even before the request comes in. So what is the benefit of that? So in case there is a service which requires quick handling, which is required to handle right away, there's no gap of, you cannot delay the handling time, then in such cases you can keep your Lambda up and running already. You can reserve those many number of Lambdas, and based on that, let's say you have 10, you're trying to reserve 10 Lambda functions, so you'll have to pay accordingly. Now let me go to the versions that I'm talking about. So for each Lambda function, you can create a version and alias. Why do we need it? Let's say you're working on a functionality, and then there's a current functionality which you're working, which is like up and running and being used by the different clients, and you don't want to get messed up when something goes south. So what you can do is you can publish your Lambda functions and then point your API gateways or REST API handlers to a specific version of a Lambda function, so that the existing functionality keeps running without any problem or without any downtime. And for each version, you can actually create an alias as well. That's all we have for this tutorial. Thank you so much for joining.